To wrap up the final sections of Chapter 12, this is going to cover Chapter 12.10 and 12.11, the spinal cord and spinal pathways. So looking at 12.10, the spinal cord. So when we're talking about the spinal cord, we are talking about coming from the brain and then all the way down to through the vertebral column. So it is enclosed in that vertebral column. It will begin at the base of the brain at the foramen magnum, and then it actually ends at L1 or L2 vertebrae. So that means the vertebrae will actually extend past the spinal cord. So it's going to be slightly shorter inside the vertebral column. And the cool thing about this is that it provides a two-way communication from the brain and the body. So if this is our spinal cord, we're going to send information from the body up to the brain. That would be afferent information, sensory information, and then we're also going to be able to send information down from the brain to the body. That would be motor information. And there's also some reflexes that are going to be covered in Chapter 13 that actually happen at the level of the spinal cord. They don't actually travel up to the brain. So that's a really cool process. So you can see here the gross structure of the spinal cord is it is traveling all the way down the center of the vertebral column right here. So when we say it's shorter, it does end right about this level at the lumbar region. So that's the spinal column. The gross anatomy of the spinal column continues. Since the whole thing is surrounded by the vertebrae, it's protected by bone. It will also have the meninges, where it will have and the cerebrospinal fluid that will be surrounding the entire spinal column. So the dura mater is only going to be one layer thick, so it's not going to be as thick as it is in the around the brain. But there is going to be this space, that's the epidural space, which is essentially going to be an area of fat and veins in between the vertebrae and the spinal dura mater. So this is where the CSF will be found, in this subarachnoid space. What's interesting and cool about this is where they will actually do a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. So right here, it's really going to be at the level right here. It's around L5. And so here's another view of it. So coming down, our spinal column is right here. Here is our spinal column. And they will actually do this lumbar puncture. So what they're doing is they're pulling out the CSF. And the CSF will attest to the state of the actual brain. So that is what a spinal or lumbar puncture. It's also the same place that they will do a during the process of labor, where they will numb from the waist down. It will be at the same location of the spinal cord. At the end of your spinal cord, it does end, so if this is your whole spinal cord, it does end in a cone-shaped structure that is called the conus medullaris. And then the filament terminality will be the part of it that continues all the way to the coccyx part of the vertebrae. Again, this is also going to be covered in our meninges, so it's covered in our pia mater. And the goal of this is to really anchor your spinal cord all the way down the length of the vertebral column. There are two sections of your spinal cord that are going to be enlargements. And these are areas where the nerves serving the upper and lower limbs come from the spinal cord. So if this is my brain and then my spinal cord right here, basically coming off of this section, there will be an enlargement. That's the cervical enlargement. And then coming off of this section, there will be a lumbar enlargement. And basically that means is that the spinal nerves that come off here go to the arms, and the spinal nerves that come off here go to the legs. And because there's more nerves needed for the arms and the legs, it creates a bulge or an enlargement in the spinal cord. So these spinal nerves are going to be covered more in depth in Chapter 13, but they are part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 31 pairs. So there's a right and a left of each spinal nerve. And like we said, there is the cervical and the lumbar enlargement. And at the end of the spinal cord, you create this cauda equina of your spinal nerves. So coming all the way down your spinal column, here's your spinal cord. It ends in this ponytail-like manner. That's the cauda equina. So you can see how this is oriented. So inside your spinal cord, doing a cross-section, there are going to be two very easy landmarks to see what is going on. So when you take this spinal cord and do a cross section and look at it right here, what you're actually going to end up looking at it is it's a three-dimensional, so it's a tube. So it will have the structure that looks like this. It's what it'll generally look like. So you can see here it is this little indentation, here it is this, and this little indentation. So this is the general structure of the spinal column when it's at a cross section. To identify which side is the back and which side is the front, so if you're looking at it like this is the dorsal side because this is the vertebrae, this is the spinal process. This would be the ventral side, belly side, or the stomach. So when you're looking at the dorsal side, this is going to be the dorsal median sulcus. So this side right here is dorsal. This side right here would be ventral. So when you look at it right here, you can look at the dorsal is going to have this little sulcus right here because it's just a small indentation, whereas the ventral medial fissure will be a little bit more in depth, and that is how you can tell which side is the front and which side is back. And it is built with the pattern of gray matter located in the middle and white matter around it. And so the gray matter is actually going to be the dark matter that makes up the inside of the spinal cord. The white matter is going to be the lighter material. So it makes this butterfly shape inside the spinal cord. The dark matter is going to be on the inside. So that's this. And then the white matter will be the other parts around it. And then right down the middle, there's going to be this central canal that does run the length of the spinal cord and is filled with CSF. So here's another perspective of the anatomy of the spinal cord. When you look at the cross section, there are going to be incoming information. So that's going to be horns. The white matter and the gray matter inside the spinal cord are going to create these sections. So the gray matter inside of the spinal cord is going to create horns: dorsal, ventral, and lateral. So when we come up here and we have our dorsal side and we have our ventral side, the gray matter is going to be a horn. So that means this is the dorsal horn because it's the gray matter and it's on the dorsal side. This is the ventral horn because it's the gray matter, it's on the ventral side. And this is the lateral horn because this is the gray matter that's on the side. So that's what these horns are, and they're going to be holding information. So the dorsal horn is going to be responsible for holding all of our interneurons and sensory information. Our ventral horns are going to be somatic motor, and our lateral is going to be mostly our sympathetic. So the big premise or the takeaway is that the dorsal side of the spinal cord is going to be carrying our sensory information, whereas the ventral side of your spinal cord is going to be carrying all of your motor information. So that's the big takeaway from this. Just like we have our dorsal, lateral, and ventral horn, there's also going to be the gray matter that is made up the axons that are coming into the gray matter, which would be the roots. So there's a ventral root and a dorsal root and what is called a dorsal root ganglia. So if this is my dorsal side and then this is my ventral side, coming into this shape, here's my gray matter, it looks like this. Coming into this, we are going to have a ventral and a dorsal root. So a dorsal, like we said, is carrying sensory information. So it is going to come in this way. So this is going to be our sensory. This is our dorsal root because it is carrying incoming information. Then you're going to have your motor root or your ventral root, which is going to be carrying your motor axons as they exit the spinal cord. So ventral is going to carry your motor out of the spinal cord. Sensory is going to carry, dorsal is going to carry sensory into the spinal cord. We have a dorsal root ganglia, which basically is the sensory, it's the cell bodies of our sensory neurons. So because we have said that our sensory neurons or our afferent neurons typically have cell bodies outside the CNS, they will have this thing called the dorsal root ganglia that is a bulge of cell bodies outside of the CNS. And this will be where you will find it, is be the dorsal root ganglia on the dorsal root. Ganglia is a collection of cell bodies. So because, again, sensory has cell bodies afferent pathways outside of the CNS, this is considered outside of the CNS. Okay, so here's another way where you can see this whole process of information coming in and information going out. There's also going to be all of the white matter. So all of the white matter is everything else that is around that gray matter or that butterfly. So it's all of these other pieces. So it is going to be this, all of the white matter. The white matter will be responsible for being myelinated and non-myelinated nerve fibers. They're going to be carrying information essentially up and down the brain, or up and down the spinal cord. So it'll be ascending up to higher brain regions, descending down to lower regions of the spinal cord, or transverse from essentially going side to side. So if this is my brain and spinal cord, you will have ascending information going up. You will have descending information that can come down the spinal cord, but then you can also have transverse information that's going from right to left or left to right. So that's what's going on. It's essentially white matter is the tract of information that is being carried up and down the spinal cord. So here you can see this is all of the ascending. So this is sensory information over here, whereas this is descending. So this is all motor information. So you can see how these pathways are traveling up or down and are very organized within the spinal column. Knowing these specific ones we'll cover in the next section. What can go wrong with these spinal cord disorders? So there's a couple big ones. We're going to talk about three main ones with these disorders. So when things go wrong with our spinal column, it's traveling information up and down. So that can lead to localized injury to the spinal cord, can lead to paralysis is going to be the main one, or paresthesias. So that's where you're going to have damage to incoming or outgoing sensory tracts. Paralysis is you've actually damaged the root or the horn. So parasynesthesis is where you're not able to perceive sensory information. Paralysis is you're not able to complete motor movements, so you're paralyzed. So when we come back up here and look at our sensory and our motor, basically any damage on this side is going to be the parasynesthesis, and any damage on this side will be paralysis. So that is the difference in damage on the front or back, can be sensory or motor damage. You can also have a couple different kinds of paralysis based on the specific ones. So we're not going to focus on that as much as just the paralysis as a whole. And then wherever there is going to be the transection of the spinal cord that has been cut, it will lead to total motor and sensory loss inferior to that level of the cut. So this is my brain and spinal cord, and I have damage right around the middle, right here. Any structure that of my brain, of my body, that is below here and below is going to be loss of sensory of everything below and loss of motor of everything below. So that is going to be paraplegia, is when there's the transection between T1 and L1, which only results in the lower half of the body being paralyzed. But if you have a transection in the cervical region, which is up here, then you will have a quadriplegia outcome, which is paralysis of all four limbs. So wherever the transection of the spinal cord is very important to the level of loss of functioning. So apart from there's three other large major disorders that we are going to talk about when it comes to the spinal cord. Sorry, two more. The first one is going to be polio. So polio is something we've probably all heard about, and we do have a vaccine for polio that was discovered in about the 60s, I believe. But polio is a disorder of the nervous system, and the technical full name of polio is poliomyelitis. So it is going to be where we are affecting the health of the nervous system and the spinal cord. Basically, what it's really doing is it's destroying the ventral horn motor neurons. So it is destroying the part of the pathway in our body that communicates from our brain to our muscles. Your brain is fine, your muscles are fine. It's the pathway between the two that is actually going to be destroyed. And if that happens, your muscles will end up atrophying. But the death that comes from polio is actually going to be paralysis of the respiratory muscles, so the ability to breathe, and cardiac muscles, the ability to have your heart beat. So polio will lead to death because it will essentially cease muscle function, which are very important, but it does it because it specifically destroys the area of the spinal cord that is the communication between point A and point B. Survivors who develop post-polio syndrome can have neuron loss a little bit later in life. So that's just an interesting premise that it can still affect them. And then the other spinal cord disorder is going to be ALS, otherwise known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. Used to be called Lou Gehrig's disease because he's the famous baseball player who had it, but ALS is the technical term. And it's also the destruction of the ventral horn neurons and fibers of the pyramidal tract. But what this one specifically will result in is the loss of the ability to speak, swallow, and breathe. So what this one is doing is it's destroying the fibers that are going to the ventral horn motor neurons and the motor neurons that are going up. And it leads to these specific symptoms. If you don't have the ability to swallow and or breathe, it does actually end up in a loss of life at the very end. So ALS and polio are pretty common disorders that we talk about, but they are specifically disorders that are related to the spinal cord. Okay, the last section is going to be these pathways and these neural pathways that are going up and down the actual spinal cord itself. So most spinal tracts are multi-neuron pathways, and they're going to have a couple terms that we just need to know. Decussation means things are going to cross to the other side. So if this is my lovely little person, and we're going to have something happen here, it's going to travel up the same side of the spinal cord. At some point, it is going to cross to the other side of the spinal cord and go to that side of the brain. Because remember, the opposite side of the brain, one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. So this is what's happening with our decussation. It's crossing to the other side of the body at some point in order to make your right side of your brain control the left side of your body. A relay means it's going to be a chain of two or more neurons. So here's my neuron, my axon. Let's do it this way. Here's my neuron and my axon with my dendrites. Here's my dendrites, my cell body, another one. So it's a relay of 2 or 3 neurons. Somatopy is going to be where it's the precise relationship between the CNS spatial relationship to the body. So your brain and your spinal cord know exactly what part of the body is being impacted when it relates that information and processes it. It's not assuming it's somewhere. It knows the specific exact spatial relationship for where whatever information or whatever motor output needs to occur. And symmetries. There is usually going to be a right and a left pathway for all of the ones we're going to talk about. So we did say that it's a relay. So it does contain a chain of usually 2 or 3 neurons. So the first one would be a first order neuron, and that's going to be from the receptor and proprioceptors. It's going to be the first round of impulse. So this is the receiving the information for the first time. This is the intake of the information. And then it will synapse on a second order neuron, which is also the interneuron because it's the in-between neuron. This neuron usually will extend. So if the first order neuron, here, let's do it this way. Here's my little person. The first order neuron is going to carry the information from the tips of the toes usually up to the actual spinal cord itself. And then once we get to the second order neuron, and it's the in-between neuron, that will usually travel up to the brain, base of the brain, to spinal cord, top of spinal cord, medulla. That's usually where you'll find the second order neuron. And then that leads to and connects to the third order neuron, because this is a chain of 3. And this usually goes to the thalamus, and then it will then travel to the area of the brain it needs to go. So it will go to the actual cortex brain somehow. So this is usually a 3-chain process in your body. So we are going to have ascending pathways. This is somatosensory signals that are going up from the body to the brain. So all of these are traveling up. They are in ascending. There are 2 pathways that transmit this information: the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway and the spinothalamic pathway. So to just break these down and look at it, here's some lots of information about it, but just to break it down and do it a little bit easier, the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway is a ascending pathway. So let's do this first. So an ascending pathway, the first one is dorsal column medial lemniscus. And the easiest way to describe this is it's carrying touch information. It's going to start somewhere in the peripheral nervous system, and it's going to end all the way up in the brain in the cortex. And it will decussate, or it will cross at the level of the medulla. So then if we have the second ascending pathway, we'll have the spinothalamic pathway. This is going to be carrying pain and temperature information, because these are parts of the somatosensory. It's going to start also in the peripheral nervous system somewhere, and it will also end in the cortex, but it will actually cross or decussate at the level of the spinal cord. So the difference between these two is basically this. So if I have this, we're going to split this in half, and here's my brain, here's my spinal cord. Let's do that a little bit different. Here's my brain and my spinal cord. What we are saying with your dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway is it's going to start somewhere in the body. So we're going to start here, and it is actually going to enter the spinal cord. It's going to travel up the body. But the unique part about this is we are still going to be on the same side. So this will be a contralateral, that's the midline of the body. So it'll start and it'll travel up the spinal cord. And we said that the dorsal column medial lemniscus will cross at the level of the medulla. So that means it will actually synapse in the spinal, at the top of the spinal column, in the medulla oblongata. And when it crosses in the medulla, this is where we said that it would cross to the other side of the body. So this is where it crosses. And then it's going to go up to the thalamus. That's the second order neuron. And then after it goes to the thalamus, then it is going to go to some area of the cortex. So this is the 3 relay chain neuron that we have for the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. It's going to be somewhere in the PNS. It will travel on the same side of the body to the medulla, then it will cross, go to the thalamus, and then to the cortex. But if we have the other one, which is the spinothalamic, and we have the midline of the body being here, it's going to be a little bit different. So dorsal column medial lemniscus is carrying touch. This one is going to carry pain. So we have something happening in our PNS, which is painful. and it will actually cross first to the other side. So your first connection will be on the same side, and then it will cross to the other side. And then it will travel up to the level of the thalamus. So it'll go past the medulla all the way up to the level of the thalamus. So that's our second one. And then this one will connect and go to some part of the cortex. So you can see the difference between the dorsal column medial meniscus pathway and the spinothalamic pathway. So those are the ascending, and all of this is information about those. And then when we come down to descending pathway, there's two pathways to talk about with this. So the descending one is going to be, the first one is the pyramidal pathways. The pyramidal pathways. And these are going to carry motor output information. And they are coming from the motor cortex in the brain, and it is going to the level of the spinal cord or the muscle. And it will cross to the other side at the level of the spinal cord. So we'll explain what that is in a second when we compare. But the second one is going to be the indirect pathway. So the pyramidal is also going to be called a direct. This is called an indirect pathway. And an indirect pathway is also going to be all motor information. It is technically going to be not from the motor cortex, but it's going to be from the midbrain or the medulla. And this will send information same place. It'll send it all the way down to the muscle. But wherever this will cross, it will cross when it enters the spinal cord. So the difference between these two, again, so we're going to draw these the same way we drew the other one. Here's my brain, spinal cord. So the first one we're going to have is motor, so it's going to be, these are descending, so my pyramidal pathway. And then I'll have my indirect pathway to compare. And my pyramidal is going to have my midline of the body. So I'll draw that a little bit better. Okay, so what's happening with this pyramidal pathway is we are going to have information happening in the cortex. So it'll be all the way up here in the cortex where I'm processing this information, and it will travel down the spinal cord through the medulla all the way through, and then at some point it will cross right above the medulla to the other side and then continue down. It will then synapse here and go to the actual muscle. So this is going to cross at the level of the medulla, right above the cervical region. So that's what's going on with this pyramidal descending pathway. There is also going to be something of the pyramidal that will then process and stay on the same side as needed, and it will cross and connect. So if you have something where you need to activate the other side of the body at the same side, there's also a piece of this where the axons will extend without synapsing all the way down on the same side of the body. And then you have the indirect pathway, and the indirect pathway is going to also be responsible for knowing the midline and whether or not it crosses. And this will actually cross at the where the skeletal muscle is. Or sorry, at the entrance of where this is. So this is going to be at the level of the medulla, is where we said midbrain or the medulla. So this will come into the here at the level of the medulla, and it crosses immediately. And then it will go down the same side of the body, and then this will connect to the muscle somehow. But this would cross at the level it enters at the medulla. So you can see the difference between both of these types of pathways, with the direct pyramidal and the indirect or multi-neuron pathway, where it goes from the brainstem motor nuclei all the way down to the muscle itself. So those are the major ones that I want you to know when you're focusing on the motor pathways and the ascending sensory pathways. But there's a couple other things that can go wrong with these pathways as a whole, not just the spinal cord, but these pathways. So the first one is cerebral palsy, which is a neuromuscular disability, and it is specifically related to voluntary muscle movement. So it's usually seen with some sort of spasticity or frequent motor tics or movements because it's a motor diagnosis. You can also have anencephaly, which is going to be particular parts of the brainstem and cerebellum never develop because it does not fold correctly in utero. So basically, this was the big part of the Zika virus, which was 2019, 2018, somewhere in there. If this is our brain and our spinal cord, essentially what it's saying, Zika or anencephaly, is you stop developing here. So we develop from the bottom up. And then if you stop here, you don't have any of that. So you're essentially just stuck in the functionality of the brain stem cerebellum. And then another piece of development with this is going to be spina bifida. So spina bifida is when the vertebral arches do not work to enclose your spinal cord during development. So you are left with an exposed spinal cord following birth. So this can, depending on the level of seriousness, we can actually have surgery to cover it up or have to take other functions around it. But essentially it's if the meninges, the CSF can protrude through the dorsal spine or whether or not it just hasn't sealed. Spina bifida is the incomplete formation of that bone. So those are the general structures that are kind of developmental related of how the nervous system can go wrong. So that's wrapping up the end of chapter 12.